It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 546, and it's May the 23rd, 1982. There are so many articles of interest in the news just gushing out in the past few weeks and months, but four in particular caught my eye that pertain to information that I've had on the air for the last few years, many years, on KLRB, and are now coming to a head in the Battle of the Falklands. One was Jack Anderson's article this week, Falkland Questions. Could an obscure war over some barren islands in the South Atlantic erupt into a major Holocaust? Would the United States become embroiled? These questions hang like Antarctic storm clouds over the Falkland Islands. And he goes into the sophisticated weaponry that could be used that's available both to the Argentinians and to the British and, of course, to other nations, and asks the question, is this going to become something much larger, these clouds overhanging the Falklands at this time? The next article was a continuation of the CBS report last week on 60 Minutes about the importation of Nazis into this country, and they elaborated a little more. Not only did the State Department bring them into this country and destroy the records of their being here, but they were trained for specific hit squads to murder and to perform political assassinations and to start civil wars behind the Iron Curtains. Now, the weapon war and the Antarctic space satellite war, the area in Falklands and Antarctica for the satellite stations has been a project I've mentioned many times, or originating with the book Project Paperclip, that brought the Nazi war scientists into the United States and down to South America and down to the Antarctic region for military purposes the minute that World War II was over. And this story of the hit squads is typical of the research that I've had, that the exiles from various countries, such as the anti-Castro Cubans, the white Russian Solidarists, were all involved in the assassination of John Kennedy, that we bring these people over from other countries and train them specifically to go back, whether it's in Hungary or Poland or Russia or Cuba, start civil wars, have civil unrest, even if there was a revolution that kicked them out. These were the corrupt people, these were the mafia types, the goon squads, the killers over there, the Southeast Asians we brought over, the CIA, the dangerous ones, the killers, and we are making them security guards in this country and training them to kill and then go back to Southeast Asia, and some of them can be very useful in this country. So, again, we didn't just give them a safe haven away from the Soviet Union. We didn't incorporate their expertise into our universities and into the hospitals or schools or even some of the military, but trained them for hit squads, for political assassinations, to send them back to other countries to be murderers, which is very much part of the literature coming out of Galen's Spy of the Century and the use of the Galen Agency, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and the Eastern Division, who was then brought to the United States and has trained these assassins all over the world. Another article, Air Shuttle's War Role Revealed. Now, that great space shuttle that everybody watched taking off and landing the first 3 flights is now going to be converted to national defense and military uses, and the space shuttle will now be routine after the 4th flight for the Defense Department. And an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel this week, Mr. Hartsfield, said the shuttle is a national asset. The military can derive a great benefit from it. And, of course, the military use of space is what the purpose was in bringing scientists here to have these terrible kind of wars with lasers and beams that could burn people on sight down on Earth, select a particular home or human being and instigate fires or large areas. Another article in the paper this morning, San Francisco Chronicle, from the Night News Service, U.S. fears the fighting will spread across South America. And before Ronald Reagan took oath of office and while he was running for election, before he was even elected, I was trying to illustrate that if you get Ronald Reagan, you get World War III, that he was the selected leader and that the entire Washington, D.C. establishment is set for World War III, and Alexander Haig would love to be riding on that horseback as commander-in-chief. He's supposed to be antagonizing the South Americans by favoring Great Britain, but the White House this week entertained the president of Brazil, and the United States can send all the weaponry to Brazil that will supply Argentina. There is a wheeling dealing here, and I wouldn't trust Alexander Haig any more than Prince Bernhard, who was in the SS, Hitler's stormtroopers, and Representative I.G. Farben, and then during the war in the Netherlands becomes a representative of the Dutch resistance. What we're getting here is a man who's played the dirty end of this war battle scene, never wanting peace, never making peace. Wherever he goes, there's war. And this story of our fear, we fear the war will spread. We have encouraged it to spread, and that is the thing that this administration would have and love, and would have war powers. Ronald Reagan would love to have war powers. Whenever I lectured at various universities, when I was traveling around at those universities, or people write to me for a bibliography on how to study the political assassinations in the country, I have three references that are number 1, 2, and 3 before you get into any of the details of who killed John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King. And one was always Project Paperclip by Clarence Lansby, of the importation of Nazi specialists into the United States. There were 642 Nazi specialists, but they were sent all over the world and down to South America and Argentina and settled in this country and moved around. And if you don't understand the role of these particular people disguised as scientists, some were and some weren't, they were war criminals, you can't understand what happened to America. The other book, of course, is the Cookeridge book, Galen's Spy of the Century. There's many good books about Reinhard Galen. In fact, one that he wrote himself, there's a lot of information. But when he gets $200 million from the CIA to form assassination teams, hit squads, working with Otto Skorzeny and all his top Nazis from Hitler's regime, and he comes to the United States and goes right with the OSS and forms the CIA, what we had really is the selling out of the United States to that Gestapo. And, of course, next were my 3 articles that I listed that give an overview of the American assassins, how Nixon came to power, and the transfer of power in this country to Galen and to Himmler's SS. And if the news of today is about space wars, World War III, the advanced technology that's down there in that area that has not yet been used but can be used, the origin of understanding all this goes back to these books that have been available for a long, long time. In Project Paperclip, just in the beginning of the book, it tells how the Joint Chief of Staff first had an objective called Overcast in July of 1945. Now, keep in mind that the war was over in April, or winding down April, May the 8th, 1945. So by July 45, they were going to bring in 350, in quotes, chosen rare minds to increase our war-making capacity against Japan and aid post-war military research. You have 2 months after the war. You have May 8th. By July, they had arranged a project called Overcast, chosen rare minds to increase the war-making capacity of the United States. The war has been over 2 months, and aid post-war military research. And in the spring of 1946, the State Department, the Navy, the War Department had a military program which was called Paperclip, where the quota was 1,000 specialists, and they transferred their family to the United States and made them immediately offer them citizenship. And according to Project Paperclip, they had a denial value in military terms. Nobody really knew who they were. They were called scientists. And it was decided that the national interest would be the immigration of these people, these specialists, for employment into civilian industries and non-profit institutions of learning and research. It was right after the war, when the OSS was going with Wild Bill Donovan, that Elmer Bobst, the man behind Pepsi-Cola, and Richard Nixon and the Nazi war criminal Otto von Bolschwing got interested in the American Cancer Society and worked with members of the OSS and took over the American Cancer Society. So these renowned Germans, approximately 50 preeminent specialists immediately, and then thousands later came with their families into the United States of America and actually infected us and brought with us to us the fascism that they were doing all over Europe and brought it to American soil. And if you don't understand this process, you can't understand today's inflation or bank robbery or the missing millions of money or the high interest rates keeping wars going and the way this country is getting polluted and falling down with jobs, housing, and provisions for the elderly and so forth. It was the importation of these people that they had worked as specialists in Germany from the end of World War I to World War II, some of them, and brought here within days after World War II was over. Now, I referred several weeks ago to a book, Assault on Eternity, about Admiral Byrd down in Antarctic area when the war was over and when these Nazis were brought here. And a listener to World Watchers obtained this book for me at the library this week. And I want to just give you a few more quotations from that book in addition to mentioning the review of the book. It's called Assault on Eternity by Lyle Rose, published by the Naval Institute Press in 1980. And chapter 13 is called Eternity Restored, the purely military benefits of high jump. Operation High Jump was Admiral Byrd down in Antarctica, 1946-47, when the Nazis were moving down to Argentina and Antarctica. The military benefits of high jump were more impressive to the admirals, seemed even more impressive to the admirals. As a naval cold weather exercise, there was inestimable value down there. They got a real insight into problems you have to risk in the polar regions. In this rapidly shrinking world, which I mentioned last week, Admiral Byrd had the following plan for the Arctic polar region, the basin, because the short route between eastern and western hemispheres, and it was important to strategic area and battleground in any future major conflict. Now, this was decided in 1946 for us, that the battleground down there would proceed. And then the book goes on in choosing to emphasize national security aspects of Operation High Jump with Admiral Byrd and to subordinate scientific interest and inquiry to the military needs. They're going to subordinate it. Byrd and Mr. Cruzen placed the operation in Antarctica firmly within a temperamental program framework, and it was similar to the Manhattan Project during World War II in secrecy. It would culminate in the space race in the late 50s and 60s. Operation High Jump was the first post-war effort to melt science and military in a partnership that would protect or enhance national security. This was the first post-war effort. Within days of the war, they were deciding that our science and our military would have a partnership. Now, this went into hospitals, this went into prisons, this goes into the high rate of cancer. 1 out of almost every 5 people is having cancer today, into chemicals, into food, into fertilizer, to the acid rain that is coming down, and so forth, the employment where people are getting cancers, the testing of bombs. The military and the science made their first post-war effort down in this area to enhance national security. Now, it's a tragedy that they define for us what is security. When did the admirals get the brains? When did they get the philosophical background to determine how we are secure? Are we secure today because they loused up this world from World War I up to the present day? Are we secure with what they did to the schools, the medium, the television, the movies, the educational system, the trash that's thrown at us, the health system? They had to determine for us national security. No thanks. I think the military should be removed from all these decisions and civilians put in the decision. This book, Assault on Eternity, said in the wartime Manhattan Project, and that was the atomic bomb, which produced the atomic bomb, as in High Jump, the Antarctic area, the latter deep freeze expeditions to Antarctica and the space program or so forth, they had the same objective and commitment. They in other words, what went on down in Antarctica was the same objective, only using space, as the Manhattan Project had, of using atomic bombs and dropped with airplanes over Japan. This time, the objective was the same, but take it up a little higher. Their goal, as they perceived or defined it, was that we have to understand how to operate in polar climates, which they did, and how to most effectively prosecute the next war. How to effect the next war. Well, thank you very much. But who decided that the next war would begin in 1945 and 46? I know who decided it. A man who wrote a book called The Secret Surrender, Alan Dulles, decided. There's another book on the subject, Operation Sunrise, that I'm going into, but I'm talking about treason of the highest level now. There's a book that came out by Howard Watson Ambruster called Treason's Peace, P-E-A-C-E, and it's the story of I.G. Farb and the German Dies and American Dupes, it's called. This book came out in 1947. Well, we had already been duped before the war was over, because I have spent maybe 10 to 12 hours a day going through books and fingering the dates from 1943 to 45, when America was agreed upon and sold out to the Gestapo, to Adolf Hitler, who planned a very clever stalling of time in a specific area known as the Battle of the Bulge, which I am going to define for you from a very interesting book. Many books I'm reading, but I call the objects or the articles I'm talking on now Treason's Pieces, because there were pieces of the treason and America was sold out. So by 1946 and 47, when Admiral Byrd went down to Antarctica, these people already had a place. They were planning, in this book, Assault on Eternity, it says they were planning the next war. Is there any better title than this book, Assault on Eternity, that describes the plans for World War III of the type that we're going into, decided before the other war was over, or even Alan Dulles' own book, The Secret Surrender, which he did. They gave this country away. They didn't have to, but they planned the next war. And according to this author, Lyle Rose, we had to invest vast sums and energy in South Polar research to derive as much benefit and prestige as they did, whoever they was, to get to the moon before anybody else. They had the manpower. They had the massive application of money and technology. I was reading a book, another listener to World Watchers got for me on the, it's called The Poles, and this is on Antarctica and the South Pole, and this shows atomic energy being brought in 1961. I mentioned last week or the week before they had it in 1968, but atomic energy was down there in 1961. Now, when did the selling of America take place? I believe there was a specific date of treason. I think it happened with Herbert Hoover. I've mentioned this before. Nothing is more clear than the deal that he made to give our tax money to the Poles, the Russians that moved into Poland at the end of World War I. The book, The Great Conspiracy Against Russia, is known among some researchers. Some of you listeners are not familiar with it. It's by Michael Sayers and Albert Kahn. And, of course, I might ask the riddle or the question, what president of the United States owned $1 billion in Tsarist Russia? And the answer is Herbert Hoover. $1 billion in oil, in minerals, in forests, and the timber and so forth. This was in the Tsarist Russia. And when the communists came in, he was livid. The president, the future president of the United States that brought us down to that depression, had $1 billion in Tsarist Russia. And there's a quotation in the book, The Conspiracy. Bolshevism, said Herbert Hoover at the Paris Peace Conference, is worse than war. In this book, The Great Conspiracy, it goes into the details of funding a huge amount of money that was meant for the poor. He was supposed to be the great knight that fed the poor with the famine after World War I. In this book, it says Herbert Hoover placed millions of dollars worth of American relief supplies at the disposal of the Poles. On January the 4th, 1921, Senator James Reed of Missouri charged on the floor of the Senate that $40 million that Congress had allocated for relief funds was spent to form the Polish army in the field, and much of the money raised in the United States for relief was given to these people to fight the Soviets that were now in power. Hoover made it clear in his report to Congress, January 1921, that he accepted $100 million for the relief, and the report showed that almost all of it, $94 million, that was accounted for, went immediately to the White Russian armies and Allied interventionists who tried to stop the Soviets from taking the $1 billion of investment away from Herbert Hoover, who became Secretary of Commerce and then President of the United States, and then formed the Hoover Commission in 1947 to reorganize the Constitution and the federal government without having a constitutional convention. Now, as I say, Alan Dulles, in his book, The Secret Surrender, describes how he was meeting in April of 1945 and earlier. The war was over in May the 8th, 1945, but he was meeting continuously during the war in Bern, Switzerland, with members of the SS, Hitler's SS, and with members of his organization and Donovan's known as the OSS. And Stalin got wind of the fact that they were trying to make a deal with Great Britain to move the other part of the world and attack the Soviet Union, who had been our ally, instead of settling the war the way it did turn out. So Stalin was wiring Franklin Roosevelt, what are you going to do? In this book, it says April the 3rd, Stalin answered Roosevelt's message, and he was furious. Among other items in Stalin's piece, there's a claim that the Germans had agreed to open up the front to English and American troops and let them move to the east, while Britain and Americans exchanged the possibility of easing the armistice terms for the Germans. Now, Franklin Roosevelt answered Stalin on April the 5th, and they had a correspondence going until April the 12th, and Roosevelt had assured him he wasn't doing that, and April the 12th, the day of the last message, was the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. And the secret surrender didn't go through officially. The Russians did move into half of Germany and got that far. But what Hitler did and the SS was to take all of his intelligence and his Gestapo men from the Russian front and move them to the west so that they could be brought immediately to the United States when the war was over. Now, this was a pretty good trick, and the Battle of the Bulge is something I had never studied until recently. I don't like war stories, I don't like war movies and war games, but it became a necessity to delve into this area because there were too many people of importance in power today that were sitting there at the Battle of the Bulge when it was taking place. Specifically, there was that Fritz Kraemer, who, the German of I.G. Farben, whose family were in Nazi Germany, who had an American uniform and recruited Henry Kissinger. There was Dwight Eisenhower, who delayed the Battle of the Bulge, and his reward was to become President of the United States. He prolonged the battle so Patton could get in there and not Montgomery and end the war 7 months earlier. There was Richard Nixon, who was working with the Nazis and making deals on Navy intelligence, whose reward was to become President of the United States, and if he couldn't win it in elections in 1960, his opponent could be killed by an outfit of the Galen people through Clay Shaw, Martin Bormann, and the Galen Permindex operation throughout Europe, and that made Richard Nixon president. William Casey is director of the CIA. He was there involved in the Battle of the Bulge, and at the time of the secret surrender was making deals with Nazis and organized crime and the mafia in Sicily, and that's when we really got sold out. And Senator Joe McCarthy, who was wheeling and dealing and is mentioned in some books, if I have time, I'll give you quotations. He came to power by releasing some Nazis in Germany who played the major part in the Battle of the Bulge. And Henry Kissinger came on to be Secretary of State and Director of the National Security Council. And Fritz Kraemer, who brought Kissinger to the Bulge area, went on to be plans officer for the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and could still be there today. And Otto Skorzeny, who put the Germans into American uniforms and practiced that for 2 years to form the worldwide Odessa, not only released Mussolini for Adolf Hitler, but got himself out of jail and a lot of top Nazis also. And William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS, was involved with this battle, and Prince Bernhard, the notorious Bernhard who married Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. The book Queen Juliana that was given to me by one of my World Watcher friends and loyal listeners. In the introduction of this book, it says that when Juliana was to marry Bernhard, it brought violent protests in Holland. Buildings were firebombed. Students fought with the police. Members of the parliament discussed whether the monarchy had outlived its usefulness, because Bernhard, before being the head of the Dutch resistance, was a part of the Hitler Youth and the notorious SS. He later turns out to become the leader of the Bilderbergers, that annual meeting of secret top people all over the world who make decisions on every country, major country, whether there'll be coups or murders and how they will rape them of their resources. And he was involved in 1976, accepting $1 million from Lockheed, which he didn't need. But he was part of the, when the Nazis were occupying the Netherlands, he was supposed to be member of the Dutch resistance with his background. And people that set up the Bilderbergers, the director of the CIA, the head of the plans right now in Washington, what I'm doing is taking every character that I find in these books who was involved in that battle, and I'm trying to show where they are today and how important that was. Now, there's a book that came out called Hitler's Last Gamble, The Battle of the Bulge, published in 1967. This was a French book translated and published in New York, Schocken Books, Schocken. And I'll be referring to this book many, many times on this broadcast in the future, and I might have in the past. But in the foreword, the author says that he got the idea for this book, the Ardennes Offensive, Ardennes, that's the area where the Bulge was, and he thought the true story should be told. He said the siege of Bastogne in that area during World War II was a famous story because the Allies lost 80,000 men, yet the Ardennes Offensive is better known to the Americans than the Battle of the Bulge. And he goes on to say the landing in North Africa by the Allies is written up many times, and also the invasion of Normandy, June the 6th, 1944. But the author of this book says there is no comparison to any of these events, whether the African or the Asian conflicts or anything. There is no comparison to the Battle of the Bulge because of this reason. While the battle in Ardennes gets more attention because 80,000 men died, and there were not that many in the Bulge, it still is an area that's been overlooked. The author says it's nevertheless, even though it's been overlooked, its political repercussions, both on Germany and on the Allied side, were greater than those of any single operation in the war, the political repercussions. Now, I mentioned Senator Joe McCarthy, who released the two top Nazis that were absolutely known war criminals, murdering and pillaging the Eastern Division and also American soldiers in this area. Senator Joe McCarthy's role was to turn Americans against America with the Cold War, with the suspicions, with the House committees, and get people fired and blacklisted, suspected communists under every rock. The Bilderbergers was the international organization. Casey became the director of the CIA. He's the head there now. Kissinger is the ambassador at large, and everyone involved in that dirty affair is running our life today. So therefore, it's necessary to go back to the place where they were all sitting at the time that American soldiers were being killed. They were all in that little enclave, and it was that enclave that delayed the end of the war until Hitler could get $300 million worth of art out of the area, $200 million worth of gold from a salt mine, millions of dollars into Swiss banks, some to Argentina, billions of dollars. And they needed that extra time to get their SS people prepared and the Project Paperclip people prepared to come into this country and down to Antarctica. And that's why it is such an important area. This author says its political repercussions on Germany and the Allies was greater than any single operation of the war. The military events, in the strict sense of the word, only became of interest when viewed against the background of the general strategy in the autumn of 1944. The military events are only important when you see the strategy, and it is the strategy that I'm studying. And I'm studying it now, and it isn't apart from the Falkland news, because Falkland is inches from Argentina and Antarctica. And the recipients of this technology, of these assassination teams, of the Condor assassins down in Argentina, in Chile, in Colonia Dignidad, the techniques for sending assassins all over the world for the last 40 years, was a project allowed because the battle was stalled till they could get out. And this article says there were things going on here with the Allied side. They were reticent to move and be strong, and the Germans had a plan in 1944, and it's that plan that is working today that is so important that I'm studying in terms of the past murders and assassinations and the future World War III that they determined in 1946 and wrote about. We'll take a 1-minute break and then do some more on this subject.
I'm so
Okay, this is May. The second half of World Watchers will come on right now after that break. In the book, The Betrayal at Arnhem, that I've mentioned before on other programs, this journalist, A. Lauren, the name is A, Laurens. I don't know his first name. It's just the initial A. He describes the stalling in Arnhem of the Americans and the slaughter of those people. That was just a few weeks. That was in the fall. The Battle of the Bulge was in December. But in this book, he talks about the role of Prince Bernhard and a double agent, a spy named Christian Lindemans, and the suggestion that Lindemann went to prison and died, and the true story didn't come out about him. There was a middleman named Peter Baker, described in this book, who was at Arnhem, who had a relationship with both Christian Lindemann and Prince Bernhard. And the story of what happened to the Americans in this particular section was that a double agent had betrayed them, didn't tell them where the Germans were, lied about the weather, the paratroopers didn't land. A glider fell in the backyard of Nazi agent Kurt Student with the complete plans of where the Americans would be. And this book goes into the fact that Christian Lindemann, the agent, after the Arnhem affair, goes back to Prince Bernhard to meet him. And he's among a group of people. He stood alone until he was attracted by his tall build and his manner, and he was with English journalists, and he was led by the Daily Mirror correspondent who smelled his story and went over to talk to him. Christian was not adverse to publicity. He was happy to oblige. They talked and had a drink, and later, at Prince Bernhard's headquarters, they strongly regretted this meeting with the man from the Daily Mirror, because later the meeting was denied, just as it was denied that Lindemann ever visited the headquarters before September 22nd or 23rd. The journalists tried to say the meeting of the double agent, the Nazi double agent, with Prince Bernhard, who's supposed to be helping the Dutch resistance, never took place. They tried to say that they invented it to make a good story. But the fact was that King Kong, that was his code name as the Nazi agent, was a colorful person who was remembered at the prince's headquarters, and they knew that Christian Lindemann would become a persona non grata, and they had to keep their distance. This book says it was the sorry end of a dangerous road, for Christian Lindemann because he had to die a terrible death in a prison without trial. But he was seen by correspondents, and the events took place. He was a double agent. The book suggests there were other Nazis informing against the Americans, and even hints that Bernhard of the Hitler's SS, the Hitler Youth of IG Farben, could be with Lindemann, and that they betrayed the Americans. And then, of course, Bernhard becomes a bigwig with the American establishment when the war is over. Another book on the plans for the Bulge starting in September 16th, 1944, when everything had been arranged from 43 up to that time period, tells how Adolf Hitler called his men in, the Fuhrer, as of September 44 and said, take no more notes of the daily conferences. Nothing should be told. The official transcripts should not be available. Now, Hitler photographed everything he did and was very proud of what he did, but this was supposed to be very secret. And the meeting of Lindemann with Prince Bernhard was not to have taken place, but it took place. Now, at the end of this program this evening, just for the heck of it, the last 7 minutes, I'm going to put on a song for you from Pacific Overtures that has so much to do with treason and the changing of countries and the color of countries through the meeting of criminals who sell out their own country for a piece of gold and then pretend it didn't happen. Many of you know, who are familiar with my broadcast, how I like theater. I don't like television or movies, but I like live theater, and I love Stephen Sondheim, and I love Pacific Overtures. There's a book written by a Harvard graduate in 1966 of the Pacific Overtures, and it became a musical, and the theme is the price of progress. Just as that Antarctica deal to make the war in 1946 is called national security. And the gist of this song and the play is that in 1853, Commodore Perry arrives in Japan with military might, and the Japanese don't know what to do with him. In 1 year, Japan is to be sold out and start to become Americanized, but they don't know how to meet him because it belittles them to have someone meet Commodore Perry, so they compromise and decide to take a fisherman who's in prison because, in quotes, his experience with Americans will make him equal to the task. Well, we have certain prisoners that have been presidents, men that should be in prison, presidents of the United States that followed the assassination of John Kennedy and covered it up, all of them, and covered up Jonestown and other murders. So these are our public officials equal to the task, I would say. And they take a prisoner to meet the Americans, and the point is that nothing is supposed to happen. There'll be a meeting, it'll be secret, nobody will know. So they build a temporary house and put mats on the floor, and all traces will be removed, such as the double agents selling out Americans in Arnhem or Hitler's secret arrangements from 1943 to 45. Now, there's two people to remember the story in this particular song. One's an old man who was 10 or 11 years old at the time in the tree house when the meeting is taking place, and the other is a man on the floor who is listening to the meeting. And the theme is in the song is that there's someone in the tree. If there's someone in the tree who hears it, that is what happens at the meetings, and what happens affects us all. That is the theme of the play. And 1 year later, in 1854, Japan is on its way to what they called Westernization, and at the end of the play, the emperor removes his robe, and he's in Western military uniform, and they've all sold out. And in the United States, I think our emperors and the Haigs and the Kissingers and the Fritz Kraemers and the Caspar Weinbergers will take off their clothes, and they will be Gestapo underneath. Now, the theme of this song in the treehouse is that there was somebody there when there were trees. Everything is cut down now. It's concrete. And one man who's singing says, I was younger there and I was hidden all the time. And if it happened, I was there. I saw everything. I was someone in the tree. And some of them had gold on their coats and some of them have gold. And I guess that always is what they sell out for, is gold. And some crawled around passing notes. This is from the song from Pacific Overtures. They crawl around because they're really low-bellied beasts, passing notes, just as the secret projects down in Antarctica that were as secret as our Manhattan Project of the atomic bomb, and they haven't told us what they've planned. And the song says, the day is not complete without someone in the tree because nothing happened there. They would say nothing happened there, but if one person is there, the story will go on. And the older man sings how he was hiding in the tree, but he says, I am a fragment of the day. I'm just a small person who happened to hear it. It's the pebble, not the stream. It's the ripple, not the sea. Not the building, but the beam. Not the garden, but the stone. But someone in a tree. It doesn't matter how powerful they are, how strong they are, how much money they have in the banks, how many weapons they control. Bigness isn't the truth. I learned that reading the Warren Commission hearings when you get 26 volumes and an 800-page report that has no more truth to it, say, than Treasure Island or any other story. I'm sure that Tom Sawyer has more truth than the Warren report. And it isn't the size of a book. I have a huge Army book on the Battle of the Bulge. It's 700 pages, the official U.S. Army report, and it only mentions Hitler's chief of staff, Fritz Kraemer, on one page and doesn't refer to him by first name. So you can have 1,000 pages on a subject. It's not the bigness, and it's the small. It can be the pebble. It can be the ripple. It can be the beam. It can be the stone, as long as somebody knows it's true. And he sings, I am a part of what I hear. And the thing that's of value to me of this program, being on the air 11 years and having many of you listen for 11 years and many of you taking tapes and subscribing, is that once you get these cassettes, or once you have heard me talk about Project Paperclip or Space Wars or the trickery that was going on and where the assassination teams were, such as they're admitting through the State Department, now the hit squads we've trained, we are a part of what we hear, and once we hear it, we know what happened, and no matter how many lies they tell, how many cover stories in books or newspapers, there is a truth out there, and he sings, I am a fragment underneath, but he says they talk a bit, they shout when they speak, but since I hear them, they are there. I am the listener underneath, the fellow says, who is under the floorboards. He says they read a list from a box and someone talks of laws. Always laws. The genius of Sondheim, he wrote the song and he wrote the words, is for a little bit of gold and a list of laws, a crook will sell a nation out. You send a crook to meet the Americans and that's it, and it becomes Americanized and sold out. And they're arguing, we won, no you can't, and so forth. And the song concludes with, we sit up all night signing papers, but the fellow says, I am there, and it is happening, and it is that only fragment of the day. But he says, all I'm seeing underneath the garden are cups of tea and history and someone in the treehouse. History is made by very small pieces of facts put together, not their official version, but people who were there that write about it, people that knew, such as this book on Admiral Byrd, that they planned World War III in 1946, or another book, UFO Secret Flying, Hitler's Secret Weapons, and the story of U-boats going down to Antarctica, Nazis going to Argentina, and the mass migration, thousands of them to this country, hit squads, and so forth. Each person is a little pebble in this sea, but if we put it together, we can write our history. And so I do want to play that for you tonight because I like the song and I like the play. And I think in a poem and in a song sometimes these musicians can capture what I've been trying to say on the air for so long, and we'll do that tonight. Before I put that on, there's another book, The Ardennes, The Battle of the Bulge, and I'm collecting many books. If any of you want to contribute to this, you can go to bookstores, used bookstores, and I have a list. I'll give you of some of the books I have and look for them, and let's share them together. In the book, Ardennes, The Battle of the Bulge, it refers to an example of Nazi contempt of Mr. Piper, one of the top Nazis who was a stone killer at the Battle of Malmedy, who had a record of killing. And it said an example of Nazi contempt for the acceptable rules of war was Mr. Piper, the SS Panzer Division. That's the SS, Hitler's secret, not the Wehrmacht, not the army, but he wants his SS stormtroopers to survive World War II. So he puts them all in that area so they can join the Americans as of May the 8th, open their arms, and become American citizens by May, June, July. They're on their way to the United States, or if they were in prison, they're released. And this one book shows Mr. Piper's troops on the road to Malmedy and all the people he killed. And it says not only did he have a contempt for war, but it would serve this man, a United States senator, as a stepping stone towards a meteoric career. Now, that senator was Senator Joe McCarthy. He went along with several priests from Georgetown University and men from Georgia and insisted that Mr. Piper, head of the SS Panzer Division, be released as a prisoner at Malmedy because he's such a fine person. Now, this book says Piper's command murdered approximately 350 American prisoners of war, at least 100 armed Belgian civilians. The commander of the 6th SS Panzer Division took oath of Hitler that he would act on Hitler's orders and kill any person. He would not take any prisoners. He would simply kill them. And he said at his own trial, I was told to do that, and I did that. And Piper's subordinates accepted the orders of killing of prisoners. This was part of their command. His command gained the bestial distinction of being the only unit to kill prisoners in the course of the Battle of the Bulge and Ardennes. And it's a subject of surmise. Piper has been an adjutant to Heinrich Himmler in the battalion against Russia. He burned 2 villages. He killed all the inhabitants. The veteran SS troops he led in the Ardennes had long experience of pillage and rape and murder in the Eastern Front of brutality towards Americans and Belgians, and with speed they were killing Americans at the Malmedy Massacre. Now, why in the world would Senator Joe McCarthy make it part of his career to invest over $100,000 to get Piper and his cohort Dietrich out of prison? What difference does it make to a United States senator that these men who were absolutely known killers would be released from prison over at Dachau with Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's chief of staff of this entire operation? Who puts people in Congress? That really goes basically into the whole story of the Cold War, of Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs, because both Richard Nixon and Senator Joe McCarthy made their career out of harassing American civil servants and smearing organizations in America. Until we get to the root canal or the area that really is abscessing this country, we will not have answers of how this Congress votes for every weapon system, gets us into debts of $1 trillion, the terrible inflation, no way to get out of this economic problem. Every article in the newspapers, every Meet the Press, every Face the Nation is whether this missile should be here or that missile should be there. But it's all war. You have to accept the fact that it's weapon systems, it's where do you want them located, how do you deploy them. And the roots go back to this very early period where these men were massacring right and left, and people were put in Congress at that time. Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford came in, and Lieutenant Commander Lyndon Johnson. And we had a whole group of people that were to escalate this war in terms of weapons, in terms of Korea, in terms of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Suez Crisis, the Central America, the South America, until today's newspaper says South America may get into the confrontation. Another book, The Damned Engineers, I might have quoted before, tells about the 6th Panzer Division that was so politically colored in its armored divisions that Hitler wanted to construct it purposely. He designed it the way it should be. It was his division. And he called in 2 of his best friends to command this. One was his old and valued Nazi friend, Sepp Dietrich. Now, Sepp Dietrich was the other person that Senator Joe McCarthy wanted out with Piper. Dietrich was a rough man who fought World War I with Hitler, followed the Fuhrer, and secondly, Hitler called in Fritz Kraemer, General Fritz Kraemer, as chief of this Battle of the Bulge. So what he took from the Eastern Division, from the Soviet front, as they were winding down the war and stalling it with the help of General Eisenhower and Patton, pushing Montgomery in the back, getting the gold and money out. In this enclave came our future politicians, our future presidents, Nixon and Eisenhower, Prince Bernhard with their scandals with the Lockheed and the payoffs, and the SS brought to this country, brought to South America, brought to Argentina, Chile, all over the world, into the Pentagon to advise our chiefs of staff, to form our OSS, to the CIA, the National Security Council. They decided that national security would be to make a third world war, and it seems, and according to what I've studied for the last 17 years, it was inevitable that we face World War III unless you get to the roots of this. Your candidates can run for offices for Senate, House of Representatives, President. Unless they address themselves to these issues, they can never solve the economy because the economy is just geared for war. And as it goes and you make the weapons and you spend more money, you have nothing but a warfare state that produces nothing, pollutes the world, and gives power to these crazy idiots. Now, the Malmedy Massacre, that Battle of the Bulge, was part of Patton's operation, as I say, and I will be doing many books on the, reading to you many shares of books on the chronology of the selling of this country from 1943 to 45. Maybe next week go into 8 different meetings, starting with the Nazis go underground up through the Allen Dulles, the surrender, the secret surrender. But isn't it fitting that he should call his book The Secret Surrender? It reminds me of the movie Grace Kelly made with Frank Sinatra, High Society. It's such a good title for those two that these titles are very revealing, but Allen Dulles even called his book Secret Surrender, so that if we get into that war in South America and if we continue to send arms subterfuge to Argentina under the table behind Mrs. Thatcher's back, if we play a double role, we've done it all along. It was Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig and Vernon Walters and the Buckley family and Claire Luce that told Argentina to go for it. So it'll be interesting to see how they worm their way out of it. I believe that the more I study this, and I'm studying it seriously, every day there was a treason here, a selling of America, just as in the Treaty House. And that's why I want you to hear that song, because we're living history, and as long as 1 or 2 people wrote all these different books, we can put it together because they were there, and this is our history, and if we put it together, we can be as strong as those people who say it didn't happen. So I think we'll play that now because the song is appropriate to what happened not only to Japan when Commodore Perry was there, but what happened to America when Allen Dulles went to Bern, Switzerland, and sold us out to the Gestapo.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
Now, let me ask you this.